What's up, guys? Welcome back to another installment, the final installment of the Beach Boys album ranking series on my channel. It has been about a 2-year endeavor, a year and a half I'd say, 30 records, hundreds of songs, taking a course in history through this band's catalog of this family who created such a musical legacy. Hold up, it's very loud, I'm sorry about that. But anyway, this video, this specific video, and this series in general was something that I was really looking forward to, and it was something that I've really been keeping in the back of my head for a long time. You know, the Beach Boys I first really got into probably the end of 2020, beginning of 2021. And with the music I'm talking about today, specifically this record, and you know, for a ton of the other records I've already covered in the whole series, this is a very important one for me, the most important one for me, and for a lot of you guys, very important as well. But basically, what I have to say and what I have to thank you guys for is always tuning in. Thank you for the constant support. Thank you for all the Beach Boys fans, young Beach Boys fans especially, keeping this band's music alive. You know, only 2 of the guys died and most of them are still left, but the truth is that they won't be here for a lot longer, and I think it's very important that the legacy, the torch of this band gets carried along to the next generation. And Brian Wilson, his brothers, his cousin, and their friends created something very special, and I think the project we were talking about today is the culmination of everything that makes this band great, and mainly makes Brian Wilson a fucking god of music. But that's kind of all I have to say. Thank you guys so much again, and without any further ado, today we are on number 1 of 30, the best Beach Boys record that was never a Beach Boys record. It never came out. The public never heard the full sessions until about, almost 40 years later. So it's an oddity in their discography, an oddity in popular music, and one of the strangest yet most rewarding listens I've ever had. And the record we are talking about today is the Smile Sessions. Smile, Dumb Angel, basically a project made by Brian Wilson, started in 1966, that was intended to be his teenage symphony to God, abandoning all surfing themes, you know, all teenage love. Well, I don't want to say all teenage love, but basically the simple pleasures that made the Beach Boys renowned for their earlier work. He's like, fuck that shit. I'm gonna go crazy and do whatever the fuck I want. And with Pet Sounds, you know, that was definitely a project that proved him as a composer and musical innovator. And, you know, if he only ever, you know, if he had just made that record and retired from the business forever, he'd still be one of the greatest musicians to ever do it. But I think this particular project shows a side of Brian Wilson that not many people know of. It's a very obscure record. It's only in recent years been getting appraisal. And even, you know, though it was a cult and well-known myth, you know, in the 60s and beyond, people didn't hear it. You know, the truth is it never came out. It was an album that was started and was never finished. And what actually came out in late 67 was Smiley Smile, which we talked about, I think, in video number 7 or 8, something like that. And, you know, it's a good album in its own right, but what the original sessions entailed were some of the most innovative, groundbreaking, and strange, beautiful works ever created in popular music. And there's so much fucking history to get into this record, and I'm assuming for a lot of you who listen to this band, you already know the backstory of this record, but for those who don't, you know, I think it's fair of me to give an explanation. So basically, Pet Sounds comes out in about mid-66, doesn't do great commercially, but critically, especially overseas, it was loved, heralded as one of the most progressive pop albums of all time, the most progressive pop album, you know, at the time. Insinuated a competitive streak between Brian Wilson and the Beatles. That was the album that kind of took the whole pop music world, flipped it around, changed the rule book. And, you know, you hear all these amazing artists, pretty much any amazing artist, musician you can think of, cite Pet Sounds as one of their biggest influences and most groundbreaking records, and for good reason. It's a fucking masterpiece, a perfect 10 out of 10 album. Not one song, not one second of music could be changed on it. But the truth is, even though it was such an ambitious work, Brian Wilson had more music in his heart, more things he wanted to get out. And though he was really proud and happy of it, he wasn't content with just going back to their surf roots. And I think the reason why this project collapsed was because of the tension in between Brian Wilson's artistic spirit and the Beach Boys, especially Mike Love's want and desire to keep the hits going, to keep them relevant and popular music. Also the Capitol Records, Capitol Records wasn't too pleased with the direction Brian was taking, and for a million reasons which I'll get into, I'll explain why this project didn't go anywhere, or, well, it did go places obviously, but didn't see a finalized version. But to me, it's one of the saddest stories in the history of music. What could have been, what could have been if Brian Wilson finished the record, what could have been if the Beach Boys continued on this trajectory, and if Capitol Records and the people around Brian Wilson appreciated his artistic innovation. But the truth is, even as a fucking Beach Boys nerd and super fan, this is one of the strangest and oddest and just most out there pieces of music I've ever heard in my entire life. And I think for any casual Beach Boys fan, not everybody's gonna like this one. But what I can say is, in terms of pop music, what we generally know pop music to be, I don't think there is any project or collection of music that surpasses Smile. Even Pet Sounds, even Sgt. Pepper's Revolver, even The Who, even The Doors, even that whole era of music, Syd Barrett, that entire musical scene, Jimi Hendrix, they all brought amazing, unique artistic innovation. But what Brian Wilson had was a genuine understanding of musical composition and musical sonic creation that I don't think any of the other musicians of that era were quite as tuned into as he was. Brian was inspired by a lot of older music, calypso folk, a lot of, jazz music, Americana, a lot of different shit, and I think with his increasing drug use, with his declining mental state, and his increasing artistic want to innovate and create something spectacular, that whole idea and that whole feeling of the times culminated in this record. And I completely went off on a tangent of what I was explaining the history about earlier, but you know what, I do that a lot in these videos. So as I said, Pet Sounds was released, and it didn't go over so well commercially, but critically it was great. And a couple months later, Brian and the band put out Good Vibrations, their biggest charting and selling single. #1 all around the world, was an artistic masterpiece, probably the greatest single pop music release, of the 60s in my opinion, in terms of single. But basically what took off after Good Vibrations is Capitol saw that success as like, man, Pet Sounds didn't do as well as we wanted, but you put out the biggest single of your career, and it's artistically innovative and insanely creative. So you know what, man? Here's a bunch of money. Here's some time. Do your thing, man. We trust you. And from mid to late 66, that's where the Smile session started. And as I said earlier in the video, Dumb Angel was a working title for the project, later changed to Smile. And what is basically you should know about Smile, it was a collaboration between Brian Wilson and lyricist Van Dyke Parks. For those who don't know, Van Dyke Parks is an amazing musician in his own right, an amazing pianist, composer, lyricist, poet, very, very quirky guy, but a very, very talented dude. Released an album also in 67 called Song Cycle, so for those of you who haven't checked it out, I recommend it highly. If Smile was completed, it would have been released the same year, but for reasons that I will mention, it wasn't. But after Good Vibrations, the two of them got to work on a new project, and what happened was just a fucking... what's the word for it? Just a combination of just insanely incredible music, and it's so hard to even talk about this record in depth because the truth is, it never came out. It wasn't a real thing, and when you talk about Smile, you can't talk about it as a finished record because, as I said, it wasn't a finished record. It was never a truthfully realized record until 2004, until Brian decided to come together with his own band at the time and finish it. And hold on, let me just make sure my this is off. I don't want there to be notification sounds during the recording. But what I'm holding here, just so you guys know, this is not Smile that came out in 1967. This is 2011, the Smile Sessions, a compilation of all the sessions following Brian's 2004 Smile to give the best idea of what it could have sounded like. And though it isn't a perfectly complete record, there's a lot of unfinished material. You know, Smile at the time, Brian shelved it in about mid-67. It wasn't fully completed, but you could still hear every bit of innovation and heart and creativity that went into the project. So if you were to imagine what Smile would have looked like in early, mid-late 67, this is what we would have it. Very fucking awesome album art. I don't remember the guy who did it. I probably would have a year or two ago, but I forgot, honestly. But it's just really weird. This really fucking cool and weird. You know, the open sign, you're like entering the door to this crazy project. Just smile, be happy. This was the actual original 66 back cover made. And if you notice, it says C label for correct playing order. The fact is there was never a complete track list made, and there were song titles, so they just plastered song titles on there. But I do really like the design. I do find it strange how Brian, the guy who conceptualized this entire thing, isn't on the back, but it's whatever. And then the inside features a picture of all 6 of the guys. Very cool. Brian and Mike right next to each other, and it's quite strange because Mike was the one most fiercely opposed to it. We'll get to that, but I keep saying that. I keep saying we'll get to that, but the truth is it's hard to even get into this record because there's so much to it. But what I do have to say is, like Good Vibrations, the single they released in late 66, this album's composition was basically song fragments, little bits and pieces of music recorded, you know, in short little spurts and end up piecing together. And, you know, man, the more and more I think about this record, the harder and harder it is for me to even come up with new things to say. But the truth is that this is something that I think everybody should hear once in their life. And if you have not heard this record, give it a listen. If you have and you didn't understand it, I can respect that. It's a fucking weird as hell album, you know? Completely strange. Very, very weird, very, very out there. But it's brilliant, artistically brilliant. And the musical innovations took by Brian on this record, to me, I've never heard anything else like it. And the biggest comparison, you know, I can make is Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band from the Beatles. You know, I always imagine if the band had put this out in 67, how would the world have seen it, and how would the world have seen Sgt. Pepper's if this had come out, you know, at the same time? The 2 biggest bands in popular music at the time releasing their 2 most ambitious albums. You know, the Beatles had the 4 of them in the group, plus George Martin, plus Jeff Emmerich, plus, you know, their whole circle, you know, working together really hard to make a perfect album. You know, you had Brian and Van Dyke, but Brian was a one-man band. He was doing the whole thing himself. He was really, really, really trying to prove himself, and I think the reason why this project collapsed is because trying to make a fucking Americana pop journey through through emotions and life and the world as a 24-year-old on his own, it was just too much for him to handle. And I think the combination of a declining mental state, increasing drug use, neglect from his bandmates, family, people around him, the record label, self-doubt, hearing voices in his head, it just, the stars were not aligning for him at the time. And as a musician myself, as someone who is, you know, trying to get my music out there, I will say there is something to be said about mental illness, pain, and expressing it through art. And Brian has stated many times in the past that this time was not a good time for him. He was having a lot of mental problems, and he was really, really kind of falling apart mentally. But I think sometimes when an artist feels things like that, they're able to express it into their music to push the art to a more relatable and deeper level. And I think it really, really showed in this project. So basically, that's probably as much rambling as I can realistically do for the backstory. You know, if you guys want to learn more in depth of every little bits and pieces of this album, just go on Wikipedia. But I guess I'll just have to continue on with the music on the album. Like Pet Sounds, was mainly played and recorded by the Wrecking Crew, who Brian wrote all of the music and instructed them all how to play it. But mainly, the Wrecking Crew was the one who envisioned the sound of the album, because he knew that professional studio musicians could get out a better result than the Beach Boys could. And the Beach Boys knew that too. But that's not to discredit their fucking incredible vocal harmonies on this record. The best of their career, the most ambitious, and just the most astonishing thing I've ever heard. And as I said, because the album was never finished, there is no correct track order, but when talking about this record, talking about the Smile Sessions 2011 release, I'll just be going through the track order of that release, just to make it more concise and easy. So, to explain the concept of Smile as we know today, or this specific release, it's a three-part album. First part focuses on the trek through 1800s America, Americana, Manifest Destiny, Western expansion, Native Americans with the pilgrimage and everything. It's a very, very lyrically impressive and deep and complex work, and I think Van Dyke Park's impact on this project is huge, and it should not be understated. You know, the music would be nothing without Brian, obviously. The melodies, the music, the sound of it. But in terms of the imagery, the words give you, you gotta give Van Dyke a lot of credit. I think the best lyricist this band ever had, and I think for this specific project, it just paints pictures in your head, man. And yeah, so the first part takes you on a journey through America. The second part is the cycle of life, so it kind of details, you know, the relationship between children and growing up in adulthood and the meaning of life and what it all is, and mental things, and it's real deep. It's hard to even explain it, and all I can really tell you guys is, if you want to fully understand, just fucking go to the Smile Sessions on whatever streaming service, or get the record. I mean, it's very expensive nowadays, but just listen to the lyrics, listen to the music, and you'll understand it, man. And for people who are into avant-garde things, I think you'll really fucking enjoy it. But yes, the second part is the cycle of life, and the third part, it's kind of, on this specific release, it's kind of a mismatch of this project Brian had called The Elements. You have Good Vibrations ending it off. So the third part's probably like the least cohesive, but as I said, the parts, you know, weren't visualized in 1966, 1967. Once Brian shelved the project in 1967, it was, you know, the project is something he wanted to completely avoid. He didn't want to think about it. He thought it was cursed. Multiple songs on the record, he had just a bad feeling associated with them, and it wasn't until about, I'd say, 35 years later, much later was that? 70s, 80s, 90s? Yeah, almost 40 years later, in 2004, when he got together with his band and completed his version of Smile. But the reason I'm talking about the Beach Boys version is because, to me, those original sessions, those original recordings with the Beach Boys voices can't be replicated. Though it wasn't completely finished, the magic is still completely there, and Brian's voice is so much better, you know, in the 60s recordings than he was in the 2004 recordings. Not to discredit or talk down on that release, because it's fucking awesome too. Check that one out if you haven't. And if you're into having a full, cohesive, completed experience, that one's definitely superior. But this one is probably the best representation of Smile of the time, you know? And I think one very special thing about Smile in general that not a lot of people mention is it's kind of like the Lego set of albums. You know, when most people talk about the greatest albums ever, you have history to look on, or to look back on. You have a legacy and, revisionist history to look back on this record to see how it's aged. With Smile, it wasn't until 10 years ago that most people got to hear the whole picture, to hear the whole idea in its entirety, to hear all of the sessions. So I think what makes it really special is that the way it was recorded, it wasn't mainly full songs put, back to back. It was like little bits and pieces that you can kind of compile in whatever way you want. And if you guys are really deeply into the Beach Boys community, one thing to note about this record in specific is the insane number of fan mixes. And I think that's what makes this specific band's community so special. They love this fucking music so much, and even though it isn't the most popular, especially this album, it's so cherished and it's touched so many people's lives. And when I say the Smile Sessions 2011 is my favorite version of Smile to listen to, I don't think so. I think there's a lot of fan mixes out there that use material, let's say, from Smiley Smile, or bring different elements together and enhance the material in their own way to make the album a better experience that I prefer. There's some versions of Smile that I do prefer, but if you just want the best picture of the album in the 60s, Smile Sessions is the best place to start. And I first heard this album, actually, when I first listened to the Beach Boys discography, I actually just started, the first album I heard from them was Pet Sounds, but I didn't go anywhere else after that but the beginning. I started from Surfin' Safari and just went chronologically. And I knew that Smile was a very talked about and revered part of their discography, so I listened to it right after Pet Sounds, and I just remember it was right after COVID happened. The world was shutting down, it was online school, but of course I didn't give a shit about online school. So what I'd do is I just mute my computer, right? Fuck that class, fuck that Zoom meeting. And I just put music on during my classes, sit in the backyard and whatever. And I remember I put on the Smile Sessions on my speaker or whatever, my headphones, I don't remember. And I just remember I was so absolutely astonished, but I didn't remember anything upon first listen. The first probably 10 listens, it was very hard for me to remember details of it, because it's probably the most layered and complex piece of music I've ever heard, besides classical music like Mozart and shit like that. This is definitely, in my opinion, the most ambitious pop record never made but ever made, you know what I'm saying? But I feel like I'm repeating myself over and over, but I don't really care, man. This journey, this album ranking journey has been a long fucking time in the making, and I'm just really, really happy and proud that it's gotten to this point, and I'm just very, very grateful that all you guys have stayed watching this whole time. So this is my favorite record of all time, by the way. My absolute number one musical thing ever, and Pet Sounds is number 2. Brian's fucking god, man, I'm telling you. But oh man, I guess I just have to talk about some of the songs. I mean, most of my other reviews are more structured and regimented, but with how disjointed this project was and how, just ended up falling apart, I guess it's okay for me to just ramble about random shit. But the centerpiece of the album is called Heroes and Villains. A million different parts, a million different versions. The version that was actually conceived and released in '67 was a much tamer, much more concise and cohesive single version that was about 3.5 minutes. Charted at like number 12, but it was much different and less ambitious than what Heroes and Villains could have been and is on this version of the record. But fucking brilliant. Just the vocal harmonies, the production, the sound. Just never heard anything like that. And it's just ridiculous. It's just an absolutely ridiculous listen. You never heard anything like it. And for people who've heard this album a million times, you can replay it over and over again and hear things you never heard before. One thing I could say in comparison to Pet Sounds, because the truth is, out of all the Beach Boys records they ever made, most of them are good. Some of them suck, some of them are mediocre, but most of them, I'd say a good half of them are good records. But in specific, Pet Sounds and Smile stand out specifically as Brian Wilson solo albums, pretty much. And to me, stand head and shoulders above the rest of their catalog. And a lot of people prefer Pet Sounds over Smile due to it actually being completed, more cohesive, more of a replayable experience maybe. But I feel like Smile is so much more ambitious, so much more creative, does so many more things, has way more sounds. It's just completely avant-garde free art. And the Beach Boys and the Beatles are my two favorite bands. And people compare them all the time. And music isn't a comparison, but the truth is, the Beatles and Brian Wilson were the two pop music innovators, the two biggest innovators in pop music of the 60s. That's non-debatable, man. They were, up until about 1967, neck and neck in terms of the production race, I think. And I think what's so sad about this record is, in my opinion, compared to Sgt. Pepper, this fucking thing blows it out of the water in terms of innovation. I fucking love Sgt. Pepper, a masterpiece. It deserves every bit of praise it gets because it changed the world. But in terms of creativity and musical innovation and songwriting, I feel like this album's so much better. I think there's a lot of shit on Sgt. Pepper that, even though it flows real well, I think a lot of the songs are weaker and things like that. I'd much take Revolver, Rubber Soul, even Magical Mystery Tour any day over Sgt. Pepper. But, and I can't say this project is perfect either. It was never finished, so it obviously can't be perfect. If it was perfect, it would have been released and well received and everything. So, I'm not trying to make a comparison. It's not my deal here. And you can't even compare the Beach Boys and the Beatles. The Beatles were infinitely more influential than the Beach Boys ever were. But in terms of art and expression, I think Brian Wilson tuned into the fucking gods. And I think he achieved something that no other singular artist in history has ever done, is complete and utter artistic expression. Like, I think he's one of the few people in that era of music that completely broke the boundaries of what it meant to be a rock star. And I relate to him a lot personally because, he was a very nervous guy, a very, very anxious dude, but was able to express that through music, as I said earlier. And the type of music I'm into is exactly like this. Even before I ever got into the Beach Boys, my favorite type of shit was, technical, progressive, very, very ambitious kind of stuff and metal music and things like that. So hearing a pop record, which was a genre that I kind of looked down on, I always thought when I was younger, I always thought, man, pop music's just simple shit, right? Hearing this record blew everything I'd ever heard. Every metal album, every fucking, weird underground band I've ever heard. It just kind of killed that for me. I'm not saying there's no validity into any other genres of music, because the truth is, like whatever you like, man, there's no better or worse. But hearing such a catchy and incredible piece of pop music that managed to be as equally innovative and complex blew my fucking brains out, man. Like, Pet Sounds took me a long time to get into. It took me multiple repeated listens to understand why it's so hyped. But Smile, on first listen, I was like, what the fuck? Like, I didn't remember any of it, and it didn't necessarily like resonate with me emotionally the first time. But the more and more I listened, I was just like, oh my god. And anyway, I was off on a tangent. I was talking about Heroes and Villains. But yeah, Heroes and Villains is one of the songs in here. Do You Like Worms? A fucking crazy song. You got Wind Chimes, Surf's Up, the best fucking song ever made. Good Vibrations, Cabin Essence, wonderful. And then you have a lot of like non-songs, like a lot of little pieces. For example, the album begins with Our Prayer, a completely a cappella chant that literally sounds just like a prayer. Brian at one point said, I want to make music someday that people pray to. And maybe people don't actually pray to that track or this album, but I can definitely envision it being a very spiritual thing for a lot of people, and it's just gorgeous. It's followed up by another little acapella thing called G, which is like a more old-timey traditional American song, but adapted into the Beach Boys harmonies. Very cool. And then Heroes and Villains, a fucking, probably, to me, like Good Vibrations 2.0. For all the people, everybody knows Good Vibrations and how ambitious and how many parts there are. If you're into that shit, check out the Smile Sessions versions of Heroes and Villains, or Heroes and Villains Part 1 and 2, which are also on the sessions. They're just so many parts, so many layers, so many things going on, and it's just like, oh my god, dude, it's like a musical orgasm. I've never heard anything fucking like it. Do You Like Worms follows it up. It's about the slaughter of the Native Americans when the Pilgrims came to America. A very dark fucking topic, but I think in terms of the Beach Boys' lyrical catalog, you don't really get much deeper than this. I mean, Pet Sounds was much more personal, individualistic, young love, the epitome of being a young person growing up. But this just throws all that out the window. This just takes ambition to its max. So yeah, Do You Like Worms? Really cool ass weird song. Following it is a little tiny track called I'm in Great Shape. Really cool. I don't even remember the exact order because, as I said, there's so many versions of this record, and that's why I keep going off on tangents, man. But it's just brilliant, dude. And I'll just go through other specific songs in the record. "Surf's Up," I mentioned earlier. In my opinion, the greatest song Brian Wilson ever wrote in his entire career. Just completely alien. I have a coworker I work with, and we talk about music and things like that. And I sent him the song "Surf's Up," and like one thing he said was like, you know, the Beach Boys, man, they're like aliens. They just take you to another place. And I gotta completely agree, because you hear a song like "Surf's Up," and it just sounds like nothing else you ever heard. And though that song was actually released on the "Surf's Up" album in 1971, the version on the Smile Sessions features Brian Wilson's original vocal. So Brian takes the whole vocal for the whole song, as opposed to Brian and Carl doing half and half on the "Surf's Up" version. And in my opinion, this is the definitive version of the song. You gotta have Brian singing it because it's his fucking masterpiece, man. As I said, "Good Vibrations" appears on the record. Masterpiece, everybody knows it. Another great song that is on this record, "Cabin Essence," was actually released on 2020 in 1969, but was originally a part of the Smile Sessions, and it's fucking insane. Like, for any fans of Animal Collective or Fleet Foxes or, you know, the High Llamas, any of these more modern experimental pop groups, this is just all that except 50 years before any of those acts ever made their music. Like, it's so hard to believe. I mean, for you guys who haven't heard this project, listen to it and you will agree with me. It's utterly mind-blowing that this was made in the 60s. It's just fucking crazy. Just the layers and the production and the harmonies, man. It's just so alien, dude. Probably the most normal song on the record is called "Wonderful." Beautiful song. It's probably the only song that Mike Love, like, and the rest of the band truly backed up. I was like, oh, it's a beautiful song, you know. But I'll get into that a little bit more later. "A Child is Father of the Man" was a little project. The chorus on there is probably my favorite moment in any Beach Boys song. It's just super weird, experimental, progressive. You know, you have the Elements, which includes, you know, there was never like a finished version of the Elements, a finished suite of the Elements. But you have like Vegetables, you have Wind Chimes, you have Holidays, love to Say Dada, you have Fire, just a lot of crazy shit. And you have a lot of other stuff on here too, and it's just wild, man. I really can't even talk. You have to listen to the songs to hear it, you know. And one thing I will say, which I should have said at the beginning of the video, but if you're a classic rock fan, if you're into like Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, Beatles, things like that, you probably won't like this record. I don't think it's for a classic rock fan, and I think maybe that's a big reason why maybe it isn't as popular. And I will admit, you know, it's not a very accessible piece of work. It's not a very, you know, easy to get into. It's not a very easy listening record, but I don't think it should be. I mean, you got to think of Brian Wilson at the time, doing, you know, LSD, kind of losing his brain a little bit, having a real tough time. I think I read somewhere online that this album sounded like a bad LSD trip at Disneyland, and it makes sense. Like, listen to this song in the background. This is Holidays. You know, this sounds real jolly, but then you have a song like "Mrs. O'Leary's Cow," or known as "The Elements' Fire," which is a fucking heavy, chaotic, crazy thing where Brian made all the musicians wear fireman helmets in the studio. He put a fucking bucket with burning wood to make the studio smell like fire. That was actually the song that was the breaking point of Smile. When they recorded that song in the studio, a building across the street burned down, I think the same day or the same week, and Brian got paranoid that the song caused a building to burn down. He was not in a very good place, but anyway, there's a lot of shit. There's so much shit, and then there's so much shit that was recorded that isn't even on the main 19 tracks of the Smile Session. So that's why I say I recommend you guys listening to fan mixes, because they take elements of the session and compile them together to create the ultimate experience. And as I said, that's what makes this album so special to me. It's like the Lego set of albums. You know, there really isn't one definitive version. If you want to get into it, I'd say start with the Smile Sessions and then go to Brian Wilson Presents Smile. But if you're really addicted to this music, just check out all the different fan mixes, man. And if I have to comment on the Beach Boys vocals themselves, beautiful. Best harmonies they ever did, most complex harmonies they ever did, most unique they ever did. They all do their best work on here. Brian's voice is at his best. Fucking Mike's voice, their voices are all at their best. Mike does the best job of his career. They all do the best job of their career. It's just everybody working at 100%. And it's a shame that a lot of the people in the band couldn't have appreciated it, especially Mike Love. He believed the lyrics didn't make any sense. He questioned Van Dyke Parks on them, and that's why Van Dyke left. He's like, okay, if you're not going to appreciate this art, then I don't want to be here. And I think once Brian lost the support of Van Dyke and lost the support of his bandmates, that's when he started, losing faith in himself. And that's what's really, really fucking sad. But you know what? The truth is, Brian's still alive. We have all this amazing music. It's been released, it's been heard, and, the more and more time that passes, the more and more people hear it. So in all honesty, is it a travesty that it wasn't released? Yes, but did we also get lucky that we got Smiley Smile as well as this, as well as Brian Wilson's version? I think so. I think the fact that there's like 3 different versions, infinite versions of Smile, basically, it's cool. It's a different timeline. I mean, if you go to a different timeline in a different universe, you have Smile released to change the world, but maybe there's another timeline where it was released and it did like shit and nobody liked it. So, who knows? But, in my opinion, Smile, Brian Wilson's magnum opus, it's just fucking ridiculous, man. And, I could probably go on forever and ever about this album, about this project. It's my favorite thing ever released, ever recorded, ever anything. And I've said that like 5 times this video, but I just don't know how much further I can go with it. And for a series that stretched so long, I started this series I think when I was 16. I'm 18 now, so it hasn't been too long, but I've changed a lot since I started this series, and I definitely feel a lot of my opinions on the other records I've reviewed have changed a little bit here and there. This album has not changed for me at all. And all I gotta say, man, is if there's one thing you guys should go away from this review with, just fucking listen to this record, and it's brilliant. So, yeah, man, I appreciate all of you watching. This may be my last album review related video, Beach Boys related video for a long time. It's not that I don't like doing them, but I'm really just into other things right now, really focused on making my own music, keeping my life together, growing up, things like that, school and work and stuff like that. And I still care about the Beach Boys just as much as I always have. But in terms of this series, I'm just proud to say that glad to have gotten all of them done. I appreciate all of you guys always supporting me, waiting for the next video to come out. I can't, explain how good it feels to have you guys being, just saying, come back, where are you, in the comments. It, means a lot that you guys like this series and support it. So, I did hope you guys enjoyed this last review, number 1 out of 30, their best record, Smile. Not one finished version of it, just the sessions, but this is fire, by the way. Crazy shit. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. I appreciate all the support, and yeah, that ends off this Beach Boys album ranking series, and I really had an amazing time doing it, and I'm glad it's done. So thank you guys very much, and have a good rest of your night. Peace out.